Everyone. My name is Lori Vashon, and I'm an administrator here at the Bureau of Developmental Services, and this is our rate structure work group meeting for April 19th, and we have other BDS colleagues on the call today that will be supporting me as we get into the presentation today. We can go to the next screen, Jess. I'm just going to go over some housekeeping things for everyone. This rate setting work group is open to the public. Members of the public can ask questions through probably, I'm guessing, the chat feature here. Jessica, is that correct?
Yes.
So you will not have the ability to participate through verbal communication. We have the rate structure work group members that will be doing that today, but you do have the opportunity to weigh in using the chat feature. This structure ensures that we can engage a diverse group of stakeholders in the dialogue of the topic today is our exceptions process in New Hampshire that we're all working on building together to ensure transparency and make sure general updates are offered to the public. If you are a member of the public and have questions about the rate work group, the rate setting work group that we're doing, all of our rate work, in the bottom of this slide, you'll see that there's an email that you can send questions or feedback to BDS at. I did want to let people know that we do have closed captioning today available for accessibility. Okay, so I'm going to get started with the next slide. So we're really excited with some of the work that we've done to date. As I explained a little bit earlier, we're working on developing what our exceptions process is going to look like in the future for CIS-informed rates. We had one group, which it was our advisory committee group, give us some feedback. And if you take me to the earlier slide, Jess, I'm sorry, I think I skipped over that. The assessment focus group of our advisory committee reviewed some of the same questions that we're going through as a group today, and they gave us feedback, and we'll be sharing those in this document, as well as there's a link to who the members were that comprised that group here for you as well, if you wanted to refer to that. So we can go back to the slide. So what we've done so far is collected a lot of feedback on what will the types of exceptions be for the CIS-informed rates that we're working towards? What will our review process look like? And what will be the required documentation for exceptions request? So we've collected a lot of that data. The information to date is included in this slide deck way in the bottom. It is available on our BDS website, and we also did send it out to our rate work group committee members. So today our focus is to look at what is going to be our timeline for the exceptions review. Once an exception is submitted, what can the expectation be of the individual or their team to get a response and an answer? And what will our exceptions review team look like? So that's the goal of today. We can move to the next slide. So one of the ways that we've been setting ourselves up here is to try to give our work team some information on like what are other states doing, so we could learn as we begin to build our process in New Hampshire from other state colleagues that have participated in CIS-informed rates and establish an exception process. Some of the things that I think that are important to note that we'll go into of one of the questions was, what is the experience trend of exception requests from other states? And what we've learned in doing some of the research is it really depends. Some states do not have an annual service authorization approval. They might have a quarterly service authorization approval or 6 months. So that would impact their exceptions process to each time that service authorization comes up for renewal. Some states have only approved exceptions for a certain period of time. It could be 6 months, quarterly, annually. So those are all things that we should consider is when an exception is approved, what is the length of time of that approval? And we might have different answers depending on the exception request. And some states really have some strong criteria around a request for a reassessment that the individual has to have a significant and sustained increase in support for a period of at least 6 months before before a formal exception is placed. We've talked about that a little bit, where here in New Hampshire, we also have crisis dollars to meet an immediate need. So it's kind of looking at, is this something that's going to be long-term for the individual? Let's, watch and pay attention to that. And then in some states, they require, that to be supported by a period of 6 months. So other states have certain types of services that they don't allow an exception request for. So that was interesting. But up above in Rhode Island, to give us some examples, and we're still in the process of gathering as much information from other states, the percentage of individuals who did receive an exception was around 8%. In Virginia, so we've talked about two ways. One is an exception is if the CIS was conducted in an appropriate fashion, the team believes that there were no questions about the implementation of the CIS, then you would go to the exception. Another possible request could be if they felt I just want to point out here, if they felt that there was a flaw in how the assessment was completed and challenging that. But in Virginia, less than 1% of the individuals requested a CIS assessment due to a significant life change. So this is just information for us to ponder, figure out how does that relate to how we do things in New Hampshire. Another interesting point in Rhode Island is that requests for supplemental funding for supported employment used to have to go through an exceptions process, but that no longer happens, and it's done through the person-centered planning process. So it looks like they were really making sure that supported employment was, an employment first, type of philosophy where we want people to be working and getting that, as independently as they can be.
So us getting this information too, I think as we talked last month, and there were all the questions we were trying to figure them out, and you guys had asked of us, understandably so, what are the exception rates in other states? So getting a couple of states' information in response to that, but I think because we were all trying to figure out within this recommendation, as we're talking about things like, what should the turnaround time be? What should be allowable to be, to have an exception, and when? We were trying to figure out, is there other information we could glean from other states to figure out, is there a secret to success? So when looking at the variable, the rate between 8%, for example, and Virginia being 1%, and we have some other state information, I believe, that we'll share in some other areas. It really depends, is what we learned, based on all of those other things, all the other questions that our group is trying to answer through this recommendation. So as Lori said too, within Rhode Island, seeing a higher an 8% rate, things such as, their levels of funding and what the difference between those might be. And then in Rhode Island, we discussed last month too, what do we want an exception to be? Do we want an exception to the CIS itself? Or is it really how the levels of funding might be called out or might be identified by those things? In Virginia, they are a state that does not allow an exception to the CIS. You can only appeal the CIS if there was something that happened procedurally. With an exception, as we noted below, being if there was a significant life increase or a change that would last more than 6 months, or, more than maybe crisis funding or some type of interim funding would support, it was projected or anticipated or learned at some point within that initial period that it might be a long-term change. So this is all meant to be information, just additional food for thought as you guys are contemplating what some of the recommendations might be in the last couple of questions we have. And then certainly as it might apply if it were to change what you all might have thought or recommended last month for some of those other questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Jess, for clarifying that. Again, the goal of our team is to develop what we think will make sense for New Hampshire. We know our service authorizations are typically authorized on an annual basis. I mean, if an individual only needs a service for a shorter period of time, we can always do less, but we can authorize up to a year, where other states might have a service authorization that's a shorter time frame as well. So those are all factors for us to consider. So we
Lori.
can go. Oh, go ahead.
Ellen's got her hand up. I didn't know if you
Ellen,
saw
I'm
it.
sorry. Go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, just a kind of a simple question, but do you know in Rhode Island and Virginia who conducts the CIS?
So it's different in each. I don't know particularly. I don't know, Carrie, if you know that, but oh, you do for those states. Go ahead then, Carrie, jump in.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning. When we get down, we have that on the slides.
Yeah.
When we get down to Rhode Island uses state social caseworkers,
Yes.
and Virginia uses Maximus as a vendor, but we did put some of those details as we look at kind of the team composition.
Right. And that's what I was going to say. When we were meeting with other states, we've seen it done two different ways, either a contractor or they're doing it within as a state employee. So there's different approaches as well, which I think is a good point you bring up, Ellen, is that's also it's done differently depending on the state. Did you have further question? Go ahead.
No,
Ellen.
that's helpful. It's interesting. Maximus that probably has pretty standardized procedures. Who knows what to attribute that 1 and 8%, but thank you. I appreciate that. Is it Christy? I'm not sure who that is.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Carrie. Thanks.
I just want to jump on that. Some states have two different CIS vendors too. So it's very interesting as we look at what are other folks doing. And we've been meeting with them, and there's advantages and disadvantages, as we all know, to how that's strategized. Carrie.
Yeah, just wanted to add one other quick comment that might be helpful as we think about kind of the factors that influence kind of the volume, or Ellen, to your point, the 8%. So Rhode Island's structure, similar to Georgia and a few other states, individuals get a CIS, like a level or a tier, and then that defines their tier package. And so that's different, right, than what New Hampshire is contemplating, where the CIS will inform rates, but it doesn't inform a tier package. And so I think when you look at like Rhode Island, and we don't have data on a few other states yet that are structured like Rhode Island, but I think you can probably expect those rates or the volume would be higher because individuals might bump up against a tier level, and they might, like to the supported employment, they might want to purchase additional services, but it would bump up against that tier level, resulting in an increase in exceptions request. So I just think structurally states are using, CIS-informed rates in different ways, and that's certainly a factor to consider in relation to how New Hampshire is looking at it differently.
Matt.
So
thank you. That's helpful.
What model are we closest to compare to for other states? Or where we're going with this? Is there another state that's similar that we can take inference from? Would that be Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts?
I don't know if I can. Carrie, do you want to weigh in on that?
We're kind of taking like bits and pieces from different states.
Matt,
I think based on the research, and to make a very New Hampshire
right
tailored package.
One, we haven't made final decisions yet, right? So I can't say, oh, now it's looking like this. So And I have a feeling, knowing how we do things in New Hampshire, we're going to take like, we like this, we don't like that. So, but Carrie, I don't know if you had anything to add on that. We haven't made final decisions yet on, we're just getting a
No.
lot of feedback. So,
No,
Matt,
but
do you,
just,
do
I
you
mean,
mean
when
our
you're looking at, like,
recommendation?
when you're looking at car manufacturers, right? You know, you look at it and you say, okay, or car
Yeah.
types, you're gonna say, we want
Yeah.
a pickup truck, we want a sedan, we want this.
yeah,
And although the, you know, different accoutrements or packages are different, the spoilers are different, whatever, you still drive off the lot with a truck, or you drive off the lot with a sedan,
hmm
or an RV for that matter, whatever it may be. Is there any vehicle that we're looking at for the future that is more like what we're thinking about? And this is more of a, like a nebulous kind of a question, or is there one that, because I don't think Vermont or Rhode Island are at all where we're going with this. But when I hear this, I hear there's large portions of kind of like how Hawaii and Florida and Maine may be doing it. And so is there one that's more like the other? And the answer could be, I don't know.
yeah,
I'm just
Yeah,
asking.
Based, I mean, the recommendations we're making so far, we really truly are. So far, my observation of what the group is doing is kind of taking things that are like different states, not completely like one particular state. So the way we talked about last month, the types of exceptions, you know, what's an appeal, what's an exception, that's definitely sounding a lot like Virginia. You know, and how they structure that as well. Then when we move into some of the other recommendations and when we start talking about timeline with the group thinking maybe weekly makes sense, you know, looking at the states, that would be, and that might have been Virginia too, when they meet
Yeah.
weekly on their specialized or customized
Yeah.
rate process. Rhode Island kind of having that spirit of allowing, you know, those exceptions to flow through, but then us, you know, looking at how Rhode Island links to the support levels. But as Carrie mentioned, because it informs on a tier package and we would be
Yeah.
aligning it to specific services and not a full package, that kind of being so far New Hampshire's own spin at that by taking a look at maybe some of the what we assumptions, I guess, on our point or part, and maybe not assumptions, but lessons learned from other states too, as they as we're taking a look at those 8% exceptions, 1% exceptions, you know, what are the reasons for that, and understanding that too, because we don't want to march blindly towards a 1% because that looks great and then realize that there's kind of something else in there that we don't love either. So I guess the short answer is, sorry, that was a little long-winded, but the short answer is
No, it's a good answer.
we're kind of pulling from each state in this recommendation so far is my how I'm looking at it, instead of moving towards one particular state, because there's so many of them in our research. We've kind of said, yeah, there are pieces of that we like, pieces of that we don't love. So there's not one yet that we've said that's the model that we want to follow.
Yeah.
Right.
I
And
mean,
in
as long
addition,
as,
oh, go ahead, Matt.
you know, I mean, I think my only concern is we end up like a Johnny Cash Cadillac, that model, like a 67, 74, like 10-page or, you know, 10-pound booklet.
Yeah.
I don't want to end up like California or New York, where they over-engineered everything and they literally broke their budget to the point to where no one gets anything.
Agreed.
Or
And we
everyone
don't want
gets
a golf cart
everything.
either, right? Like no
Yeah.
golf carts, no Johnny Cash
Right.
Cadillacs. You know, what's what's right for New Hampshire?
Yeah.
And obviously, we're going to need to trend how many exceptions we're receiving, because that's going to give us feedback too. So if we see a lot of exceptions coming in for a very particular area of service, the question is, are we hitting that service right or not? And what do we need to look at to change that? Because by definition of exception, it should be a small percentage of individuals, right? So that's one of the things that I think is really critical, is that we're tracking and trending that data and then using it to inform us of how are we doing with services in New Hampshire.
And are we going to take, and this is again, I don't know question, so feel free to say I don't know. Are we going to take the approach like with health insurance benefits, where you have that annual renewal and unless you meet these X, Y, and Z criterion, you're not switching? Or are we gonna take the, you know what I mean, like,
My
like a
answer
covered
is I
event?
don't know.
Okay.
So, that's
like in-
not, yeah.
Like with our health insurance premiums, unless you get married or you have a baby or
Oh,
someone loses their, like, they have very specific
like open
criteria.
enrollment time and
Yeah,
if you
are
miss
we
the
gonna-
window.
So that, I guess
I
the
think
question is that an approach that's
So I
even
think-
remotely
I
on the
think-
table?
Well,
I'm
I think
looking at
it's,
our recommendation from last month, and I think we said no, that if somebody needs an exception,
yeah,
that they could ask for that at any point in time. But
No,
don't,
I'm saying, are we gonna be limiting the exceptions to like certain qualifying events, I guess is what I'm saying. Because if you have something that's like peripheral or on the cuff where maybe we're trying to and Lori, you might be seeing where I'm going with this because of the recent events that we've been sharing. But if we see like a problem about to hit the horizon, are we going to be waiting for the problem to hit the horizon, or are we going to, because that's the one thing I think about the New Hampshire system that needs to be preserved, is right before, if we start seeing someone's start to destabilize, or we know that destabilization is going to happen for a myriad of reasons, we can call and say, we got to get some stuff in, some extra supports in place right now.
Yeah.
And prevent that. And I think that's the one thing I don't want to lose, but I also understand that we need to have very clear definitions for qualifying events for exceptions.
right. And
So
and I
will there
think,
be like an override or, and
Yeah.
that's why I'm saying, like, it
Yeah.
may not even be considered at this point. I
Well,
might
and
be
this,
putting the
one of the
cart before the
questions
horse.
were, I might have gotten that wrong, Matt. That might not have been last month. That might be
Yeah.
on deck for today.
it's coming
Okay.
up, yeah. Because the other thing too, let's not forget, we do have crisis funding. So, people do have support needs that could change for just 2 weeks, a period of time because of something that happened. So our goal is to continue that, immediate reinforcement of supports as needed. But then the question becomes, is it a prolonged need or not? And what does that mean to this whole process, right? So, okay, so oh, Carrie, jump.
Just one last point, just to reinforce that, I think, like regarding factors that impact volume, that was a critical part. Rhode Island specifically has a request for emergency exceptions. So again, when we think about 8%, they're driving most requests through an exceptions process, whereas other states might have, like what you just summarized, crisis funding, and that's around the exceptions process, which might feel right for New Hampshire. So again, just
Right.
wanted to highlight just another reason that the volume by states are different, and it's some of the policy drivers and their processes could drive those numbers up or down.
Yeah, that was excellent, Carrie. Thank you for sharing that.
And
Okay,
just
so-
confirm that it is coming up today, so perfectly timed in that question. Like it's coming up in a couple of slides.
I just want to make sure.
Thank you.
I just saw that Denise made a chat, our captioner. Has that been addressed?
I just emailed her back, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jess. Okay. We can go to the next slide. Okay. So again, in just helping to share some state examples to give us some feedback or knowledge of what are other folks doing, in talking about the timeline for the exceptions review team meeting, like what is a good timeline, what is not a good timeline, should there be stipulations about time periods when you can request an exception? And Matt, I think that's where you were kind of going towards that a little bit. Is it upon, receipt of getting your CIS feedback in your CIS informed rate? Can it happen when there's a major change in an individual's life? So Virginia, when a request is made, a final decision is rendered within 60 business days of the date of the receipt of the form. and notification to the requester and the service coordinator will be sent within 3 days of the decision. So they give themselves, it looks like a 60-day time frame to review them. The customized, I think that's with, Carrie, is that with just this, because then there's a customized rate. So I want to be clear, that's if they feel the first one, am I getting this correct? If they feel there's an issue with the assessment and how it was delivered. So that is, I'm not sure it's okay.
I was trying to highlight and I did something interesting.
That's okay, Jess. It's okay. That's why we're all here together. Okay, so the
Laura, you've got it right. The reassessment.
The customized rate, because I just want to be clear when we're saying, in my mind, I'm just going to say, when I say exception, it kind of equals customized rate versus I'm not happy with how the assessment happened within itself. There could be a process for, I don't feel like the assessor was prepared or to that matter. So the customized rate, which is the exceptions, are reviewed in less than 30 days from receipt. So that's a better timeline, I think, than 60 days. And it depends on the SIS level, how they process them. In levels 1 through 5, the application must be reviewed prior to submitting it to the customized rate review committee. And that process can take 3 to 4 weeks in total. And it might include some on-site reviews. Levels 6 and 7 can go directly to the customized rate review committee, and decisions will be communicated to the provider within 5 to 7 business days following a decision. So that's kind of interesting to think about. They're kind of looking at the level of need of the person and deciding how that process goes, which is interesting. Maine, once all information is received, they allow themselves 60 business days to respond. In Rhode Island, requests for additional funding must be submitted at least 60 days prior to the start date of the services, and requests are viewed on a weekly basis. So that's like in advance, but weekly. So it's just interesting information for us to, think about how are other folks doing it. And so Matt, just to go back to like, which state are we most similar to? It's really hard to answer because each of these components, we might choose something very different that we feel works best for us.
Yeah, I am all for entirely customizing to keep our system as intact as we possibly can.
Yeah.
I was just trying to figure out if there's a way for me to be able to anticipate the future.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I may be as bald as a crystal, but I have no ability to see the future.
Yeah. So Matt, you're building the future. That's what we're building it together here. So, okay. So, I think I finished that slide. Okay.
I get creative. Sorry. I
We're
didn't know
gonna
how
have
to do
some
what I
fun.
did,
It's
folks.
Friday. Jess is doing some fun things for me. It's like I was gonna say those shows where there's a screen behind you and you don't know what's happening and you're just like, oh, there's a storm coming. Okay, so the feedback that we've already received from our assessment focus group, we kind of wanted to go over, and then in the next slide, we're going to go into what are folks here today think based on the information you've received. One of the things that I think is important to note when we go to the next slide too, will show that if for some reason this topic came up in our earlier discussions, we tried to capture it and put it in advance you'll see some stuff in here. And that's something that we pulled from the previous meeting as we were all going through what is this going to look like, and suggestions were made for the timeline. We made sure that we did our best to capture that as well for today. So again, the questions are, what is this suggested timeline for, how often will that review team meet? Will there be stipulations around when you can request an exception, and what will that look like? So the focus group was looking at a suggestion. And again, they were brainstorming it just like we are, every 2 weeks and as needed. And then always the ability to adjust that based on volume. Coordinate with the ISA group on the timeline. Information is needed after individuals select their services. So
I
they
can
were all,
elaborate on that a little bit too.
yeah,
So
because
at the,
I'm
oh
like, oh,
gosh, I did
okay,
it
yeah,
again.
that's great, Jess. Thank you.
I did it again, sorry. But with at that point, and again, when this was all happening and being discussed, it was still very conceptual with the assessment focus group. It was a work group of the advisory committee. At the same time, there was also a service agreement work group going on. So what that
Okay.
group was saying is whatever we do, make sure that the timeline meets the individual service planning so that they're not waiting on a service agreement to move through because the exceptions process is holding up their service planning. Just a little bit of context
Yeah.
around what I went back and looked at some notes to try to get my arms
Yeah.
around what that meant.
Yeah, so thank you, Jess, for clarifying that. So most of us know that service planning in New Hampshire is done in advance of the services for the following year, typically. And so I think they're saying whatever we set up should flow to make sense for the individual and their team. The other feedback is if an urgent need is identified, we need to be able to, as part of that exceptions team, indicate what the expected review response time will be. So it's very clear to everyone what to expect. And built into the IT system, a clock for review will also provide good data for trending. And I think what that means is that it's really transparent from the date it was submitted, how long it took to review, how long it took for a decision to go back out to the group, and really track those timelines to see what's working or what's not working for the process. So some of the other summary of their recommendations were there was a concern on when this assist exceptions process can occur, and again, avoiding potential delays with the development of the service agreement. So if it's going to hold up my whole process of planning for myself or my loved one, it wouldn't be good.
It's a similar spirit from this
Yeah.
group last month to what the
Yeah.
assessment focus group had mentioned. We want to
Yeah.
make sure to time this up so that folks' service agreements aren't being held up because of exceptions out there
Right.
or requests for one.
Yeah, and so all of this is just making sense to me, that the ability of the exception team to meet quickly to address the need or recommending approval of temporary increase in funding. And again, we're going to talk more about, is that really the exceptions team role, or do we utilize our waiver service of crisis to allow for immediately addressing the individual's support needs? And that the frequency of meetings should be determined by the volume of request as proposed, and they may not meet the need. So if we decide we're going to meet once a month, but we're getting lots of requests in, that's not going to meet the need. So we need to really look at having some fluid options with that. Okay, so now everyone needs to jump in here. This is group participation time. So again, we're looking at the same questions. What should be the suggested cadence for our exceptions review team to meet? And should there be stipulations around when an exception can be requested, how that would work? What we've done, just to summarize a little bit here, is in our discussions in previous meetings, some of the feedback that was given on this in advance, because we just, are somewhat of a passionate topic as we get into it, was that we need to clearly outline the time frame for the process for each step. A 30-day turnaround is currently used as ideal, so that was a recommendation. Have a uniform procedure to ensure consistency. Time frame from the time an individual requests a change until it is submitted to BDS. So again, this is really showing, let's have really good transparency of expectations of from when a request is submitted, what happens, and expectations of a response. Making sure
Yeah.
that there's acknowledgement of receipt. Sorry, Jess, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, pulling,
Yeah.
because through the natural course of our conversation last
Yeah.
month, a lot of these topics came up before we,
Yeah.
as we would expect them, before we got to the specific question that our group wanted to respond to. So we tried to
Yeah.
pull that information to just refresh everyone's memory on what some of that conversation was so far. Some of those shared value or shared, ideals for what we were all envisioning through that discussion last month, and put them here in the section to just refresh everyone's memory while we go through these specific questions.
Yes. So, and so these are just the recommendations that, as Jess said, were already made. Some folks were saying the team should schedule a review within 14 calendar days of receipt and make a decision within 7 calendar days. So that's putting us at 21 days to stay within that overall 30-day time frame of submittal of the request to a response, and acknowledgments along the way of where that is in the process. So now we're going to open it up, and Matt, is perfect timing. You're on the board.
Yeah, I'm like that annoying kid that just throws his hand up at the front of the class. Can we consider doing like the first and the third whatever day of the week every month? So like the first Monday or the first Tuesday and the third Monday and the third Tuesday, because whatever the date would be, if it falls between there, for a fact it's getting reviewed that week. And then that way it gives a very clear expectation to whomever is getting the review that my case will be heard on this day. And if I miss submission, it's going to be heard on this day.
So you like that, Matt, instead of from the date of receipt to an answer? Because
no, I
yeah.
hate that, quite honestly. But the reason I'm suggesting that is because what I found is in working with my families, it made it much easier and it was more calming for them to know that it's going to be heard on this day versus this day. So for me as an administrator, this is like sticking myself in the eye with a pen.
Yeah.
But for my families, I'll do it.
Matt, I just want to make sure I'm capturing the recommendation. So I definitely got the reoccurring time. Are you also proposing a twice a week meeting, or are you just throwing that out as an example?
Twice a month.
Twice a month, sorry.
Yeah, the first Monday, whatever it is, like a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. If we did it on a Tuesday, it would give everyone the ability to have everything in, or a Wednesday, give everyone have the ability to have everything in by that Monday. And then we could possibly get things rolled out by that Friday. But you have it twice a month, the first week and like the third week, or you do the second week of the month and the fourth week of the month. That way it is in a cadence of almost every 14 days. Some months you're going to have, I think, 17 days in between as a maximum. It might be as much as 18 days if I'm doing the calendar math in my head and it's probably wrong. My little brain can't do it. But I think the maximum is anywhere between 17 and 19 days in between. So it would make things very predictable for our families. And Erin has her hand up, and Erin, chime in on this if you don't mind. I would really appreciate your opinion. I think it might just make things a little bit better for our families to be able to accept a delay. But I also think we should have an emergency meeting clause like we do with our board. And Lori, I get where you're saying with the crisis fundings there, but there might be something where we need to assure for long-term funding, like i.e. someone has to go to some specialized program. So, and Erin, take over. I'm going to shut up.
And I am going to piggyback a little bit on what you just said, Matt, in regards to things. I totally agree in regards to having those set meetings, but just a recommendation before that is
what you'd want to do is if we receive the application on this date, it will be reviewed on the first Monday or the first Tuesday or something like that. Because otherwise you're going to get stuff that's going to come in on Monday for a review on Tuesday, and that's not going to give the people the time.
Yeah.
So when we had our grant program, we said, you need to have the information into us by noon on Wednesday, the last Wednesday of the month, to be reviewed on the first Wednesday of the month. So that was a week's time frame that things could be reviewed prior to the meeting. So when people came to the meeting, so that would be the only thing that I would recommend, but I totally agree. People like to know when it's going to be reviewed. They don't want to have to sit there and say, oh, let me count out 60 days. Right? Because then you always get into is it 60 business days or is it 60 calendar days? And it doesn't matter how many times you tell people, people still go, okay, is it calendar days or business days? So that would be, just adding on to that. The second thing that I wanted to bring up was, it's one of the other sentences, uniform procedure. Totally agree with that. But I want to take it one step further, because if you have a service coordinator who's going after crisis funding, as well as going after this long-term funding, because if you're doing that kind of that gap stop,
Mhm.
it should be something that can feed in. So they're not doing two different types of applications. That crisis funding would be nice if it was something that was like the first part of the other application, so that it feeds into it, so that it makes it easier for service coordinators. So they might already have a base because they've done that crisis funding, and then it'll go in so that for that long term.
Good point. So don't create duplicate work is what you're saying for this. If you've
Correct. Or
done
two
a lot of
totally different things.
documentation for the short-term crisis, can
Mhm.
that be utilized for, if you will, the long-term exceptions process? Excellent. Matt?
Because Aaron had a really good idea. I have to piggyback off hers now too. Where we have, like, ours is on Thursday, the reviews for budgets and everything. If we're going to be keeping that moving forward, is there a way to have that as a first stop before they go through the exception process? Because that will help to filter out a lot of things that probably don't need an exception and just need crisis funding.
I want to, who, what's the first stop? Can you define that? Who is the first stop?
The budget meetings that we have, like ours is on every Thursday with our liaison. The liaison
So
meetings, you know what I'm
Matt, I
talking
want to
about?
clarify, are you talking as a service coordinator entity?
I'm talking as an area agency entity. But I guess the service coordinator has to come to those meetings regardless.
Yeah, so
So-
I know we're trying to that's all I'm just questioning, because usually there's a request through the provider supporting an individual through the service coordinator that's doing it. It isn't always through the
Right.
area
But-
agency.
But
So
the
I'm
service
just trying
coordinator
to,
comes to that meeting and then
Uh-huh.
gives the justification for those services. That's not how it's done elsewhere, Aaron?
No, I don't come to your meetings,
yeah,
Oh, okay, well,
and I've got folks through you guys.
you should then.
So I think-
You should come to our meetings.
well, looks
Well,
like you just got an invitation.
Just got
Aaron.
invited.
Yeah, you should. You might show us
Um,
something we need to do differently.
For the recommendation, though, what I'm kind of hearing is maybe
Yeah.
a pre-discussion, if that's the decision the group makes, we could talk a little bit more about who that pre-discussion might include. But
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
sort of pre-discussion
Yeah.
by a group to kind of say, hey, does this feel like
Yes.
an exceptions request? Or maybe, we're
Or
talking
crisis
crisis
funding.
funding. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe
Right.
crisis funding we're not quite sure that this is a long-term need, but at what point
Yeah.
do we come back together and say,
Yeah.
yeah, this is a long-term need? So
Well,
some
you
sort
might-
of pre-discussion.
You might have someone that has an intermediary need. Like, let's say someone gets knee surgery and now they have
Mhm.
a bunch of communicating maladaptive behaviors with that because they can't verbally express their pain, inability to go to the bathroom on their own, whatever. and therefore for the next 6 months, they're gonna have this enhanced need,
Mm-hmm.
but they may have, because we are not gonna know the outcome of their need, they may have much longer term needs.
Yeah, we don't know.
So,
Yeah.
so that to me would be an example of something that I would say, let's do crisis funding on a 90-day basis with up to 3 renewals before we go into an exception process. But Lori, you might have a varying opinion on that.
I think it will just depend on the situation. There will be some situations that the team knows this is a change. And although it just happened, we definitely foresee it being a long-term change, or this is a change that we don't know, right? Or we know is going to be short-term. But I kind of like what you're saying in a bit, because right now, as part of our crisis policy, if an individual is pending a crisis or within a crisis, the role of the service coordinator is to pull in the dad's entity for networking and knowledge. So I think what I'm, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I'm hearing like if someone is looking at needing to implement that exceptions process, what would the role of the service coordinator be in looping in the area agency to inform them of, the request? Would they be informed? Would they be part of it? Those are the things that.
Well, I think you can have the area agency either be in support of it or against it, because like, as a great example, we had an individual that was at their end of life care. And within that 6-month window, who cares about an exception? Just put the crisis funding in there. And it's one of those scenarios where Aaron might come to the table and I'll say, why are we going to do all this extra work for exceptions when really what we need is to make this person's life as comfortable as can be for the next 6 months. And I think that will probably prevent a lot of additional work for the exceptions crew
Mhm.
and still work within our existing framework. So I think you more than adequately explained my position. Thank you.
Are there any other committee members that are shy, or you feel like I'm not giving you an opportunity to give us feedback? Because we just wanted you to feel comfortable jumping in if you wanted to here.
Hey, this is Will Walker. Hi, everybody.
Thank you, Will.
I'm not too shy, but
Oh, you're not shy, Will.
this may have been covered. But what will be the situation where there's a true crisis at hand?
Mhm.
Is there ability to say, hey, we need to talk about this today? Is there something in there for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Our current crisis policy, which allows the team to, if certain criteria are met, to implement crisis funding on the spot. So I don't see us changing that, Will, because we want to make sure that the health and safety of individuals are met. And even if we have the best exceptions process for long term, it's not going to cover a Friday evening crisis. So that's
Are those? I'm sorry. Are those criteria well defined?
So we do have a crisis policy. It's on our BDS website. So far, it's been, from my perspective, and again, I'm just speaking from BDS, I think it's been working well. It allows the service coordinator to implement up to 4 days of crisis supports without authorization from BDS.
Okay,
I don't
great.
know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that from the field. If I haven't heard yet, and as soon as I say this, Will, I'll probably get some emails, but that it isn't working.
There's enough ambiguity in there, Will, too, so that we have the ability to adequately cover someone if they need it.
That's good. Thank you.
And the Bureau, Lori, not to sing your praises too much, but the Bureau is usually pretty accessible day, night, and weekend if something's really, really pressing that can't be solved or the numbers are too big.
Yeah, so just to summarize, the goal of the exceptions process should never replace a crisis situation. It's more of a long term, like we don't feel like the cis-informed rate is representing the individual's needs long term. Does that make sense, Will?
It does. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, is there any other folks want to comment?
I'm not sure for the purpose of the recommendation, though. Do we
Oh.
want to kind of go back to Erin's comment just a little bit?
Okay.
So including the emergency meeting clause for any type of urgent requests. And I guess my question would be, since we have the crisis policy or the crisis process, if there was that urgent need, do we think that that would likely come out through the crisis team when they come together, and maybe that's the vehicle or the folks that would raise the hand and say, I think following along this other recommendation here, if the crisis process moved through and there was a request for certain services or funding, would it tack into maybe the crisis policy in a short term or for the short term need to extend it to a long term approval? Would that be something that we would want to recommend I guess, add on to the crisis policy, that one of the things that the team would want to take a look at is this short term or long term, and is there also a need for an exception?
Shelley,
Good morning.
morning.
So I think it would be a good idea to add that to the crisis policy as a possibility, but I guess I'm also envisioning potentially, and maybe it's open for discussion, there could be a need for review of the CIS score, and it maybe is not an immediate crisis. Maybe it's a pending crisis, or it's starting to, or it's being managed in a way that it doesn't require crisis funding currently, but it's going to become more of an issue longer term. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
So we'd want to make sure to have a standard process that through the course of typical service planning, that's identified, and maybe not a crisis situation, but then if someone's experiencing a crisis, then we also have we'd have a faster turnaround, or a faster way through to get that information from request to approval or request to decision.
Yeah, that's kind of what.
I think, Erin, just to go back, what you were saying is the documentation that you pulled together to support the crisis. I'm going to start choking now. The crisis request, you would like it to be able to be utilized to support the exception, so that you're not doing one set of documentation that doesn't pertain to another. It could feed into the larger request of the exceptions. Sometimes, as we said, sometimes a team will not know, is this short term, is it long term? But if it's determined like, wow, this is going to be longer than what we expected, and this is the individual's new baseline, can we use some of that? And I would say yes, that would be very good supporting data to show this is what we did on a short-term basis, this is the benefit of that, and we don't see this changing for the individual type thing.
Yeah, correct. Just to kind of have everything flow together, so it's not disjointed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just want to make sure that we're getting this about, it sounds like we're thinking the review team should meet at least 2 times a month. I hear, depending on how that's set up, but that's what I'm thinking we're hearing today. And then what about, I just want to make sure that we are covering the stipulations around time periods as to when an exception can be requested. So we know two things. An individual right now, the CIS process in New Hampshire is currently every 5 years you would get a new CIS. So say you have your new CIS done and maybe the team is, questioning it, would that be a time period? I think I heard us say that whenever, are we going to limit when an exception can be requested? I just want to clarify the feedback of this group on that. Matt.
I think we should limit how long you have to challenge it. And so I think you give everyone 60 days to put forth a challenge and to appeal.
Okay.
And then it can just follow the normal appeal process. So from the time it's delivered to you, not when it's completed.
Yeah.
You get 60 days.
Okay.
And I think you need 60 days because of some of the capacity issues some of our individuals have. And it may take time for them to be able to sit with someone to help them work through it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's necessary.
Okay.
And then as far as the other exceptions go, this is what I was talking about with the question of, are we going to define what an exception is? And then are we going to have like an open enrollment period for that? And also how many exceptions you can get?
Right.
Because I think if you get an exception within the following year, and I think it takes that long to get everything scheduled, and PCG can give a better time frame for that. But within the following year, a new CIS needs to be completed. Because if you get an exception, that should be a red flag to all of us. A new one needs to be made. Because you're not where you were.
I hear what you're saying, but one of my concerns is the capacity of being able to get those CIS done.
That's what I was thinking a year after.
Yeah.
The
I'm still
exception should
concerned
cover
about
you
a
for a
year
year.
after, the capacity still.
Do I hear 2 years? Maybe 3?
And maybe we would consider it for certain types of exceptions, but maybe not all, Matt. So I think that's what we have to look at. We don't want to overly create, if we all agree that, and again, I'm just saying this, I'm just curious, like certain exceptions might be because the individual support needs really did change so that CIS would look different. Other things might be an exception that is really just I don't know how else to say that, but an
Well, no,
exception.
like the family changes,
Yeah.
my son's living with me, I die.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed with him. He's just going to a different place.
Yeah. So sometimes we don't want to require maybe, so we consider, which I love how you have that, Jess, as, for a certain exception, but not maybe for all, because we don't want to put folks through that if it's not gonna.
Or
So
I mean,
maybe
maybe what we consider, and just food for thought for folks, is the exception being request for every service, or is it one specific service?
Right.
If it's one specific service, do you guys think at that point the exception stands until either the next CIS, or if someone were to perhaps move to a less restrictive setting, or there's no longer the need for the level of supervision that at one point made sense for the individual? Different ways we might be able to go. If someone was requesting exception for all services, that could potentially be a trigger for another CIS.
Yes.
Different thing. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here, but
right.
How do we
or it
be
could
as
just be based on
flexible and nimble?
severity.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and focus it around medical and behavioral solely.
Yeah.
And behavioral to me is, and it's the behavior analyst in me, is temporary, because any behaviors can change and they can go from one direction to another. So I would be more partial towards anything medical being something that would either trigger assist or not need to trigger assist because of the severity.
You could even determine at the next service planning meeting, are we still feeling this makes sense? Or to your point, Matt, is there something going on with medical behavioral, either increased or decreased, that makes us
I
think
of
this
the,
might not be right.
I think of the individual with dementia. And so maybe we leave it so that there is the request can be made by the service coordination and area agency entity. And we just allow good judgment to move forward. So that, you know, if the service coordinator believes that this person's no longer reflective of their CIS, we can move forward. But if all their needs are being met by the exemption, then we wait till the new CIS comes.
Make sure I'm capturing it correctly. So at that next ISA meeting,
Yeah, I mean,
or it could be a quarterly or anything. So at the
It
next
could be a
planning
s-
meeting.
it could be a standing policy that the exception stands until a new CIS happens. But if there's some exigent circumstance that we can't all think about in a room in one day, this gives an appeal for the service coordinators to be able to utilize, to be able to adjust. Or maybe if there's a concern that, you know, the exemption didn't go far enough. It's almost like an appeal process. Aaron, help me out here. I'm grasping at straws.
You're doing okay, Matt.
If I'm capturing it correctly, that kind of the spirit of what I'm hearing is maybe let that exception stand, but at the next planning meeting or at any subsequent planning meeting, the team talks about, does this still meet the individual's need? And if it does, then kind of keep going, that exception stands. If it doesn't, you know, higher needs or maybe decreased needs, the team talks about what the next step is.
Yeah, probably at every annual ISA or whatever team meeting, it should be reviewed until the new CIS starts. And then if there is a need for a new CIS, then they can
It
agree
goes
to
until then, yeah.
Yeah. But if there's not a new need, then we're not overburdening the system for no reason, because the exemption is holding. And it may be that instead of getting a new CIS, they have to request a new exemption. And that might be the better way to go. But I think a limit of 2 exemptions within a 5-year period would make sense unless that person's really highly destabilized or, you know, God forbid, is passing.
Aaron?
So just to kind of add on that a little bit, because we're saying, you know, review at the, you know, annual meeting, review at the quarterly, which totally, completely agree with. And then that exemption can stand. I would almost say that there should be some type of, and it can be, you know, something that's developed that everybody uses. Just a quick down and dirty documentation that would go to the exemption committee stating
That it
why
was
this needs to
reviewed.
continue.
Yes,
Because you want to know something,
Yeah.
I'll be more than happy to just go on, yep, we got to keep it going.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
but to really,
Yeah.
so that there's some of that little
Yeah.
extra oversight in
Yeah.
regards to why it has to, and it doesn't have to be anything long, you know, person's name, you know, services, why the exemption needs to continue. And it can just be like quick down and dirty paragraph. You know, individual continues to have medical issues or whatever, but just to kind of have that little bit of oversight.
It's acknowledging that the team has reviewed it, because one of the other concerns I'm just gonna put out there is sometimes the exceptions team might say, yes, this definitely is an exception because of 50 life changes that happen for this individual. I'm not so sure that exception might apply for the next 4 years. So, I'm a little concerned about having a blanket, like this is an exception for 4 more years. I don't know how you guys feel about that. We don't want to overburden anyone, so there could be that flexibility to do that. But I think that there would be some times that we wouldn't want to do that longer, but Matt.
Oh, so I was gonna say, maybe we put in there a time period of review onto that
Yes.
where it has to be reviewed.
Yes.
And it could be upon nexus, it could be 1 year or 2 years.
Yes.
I don't think any except if it's less than a year, it shouldn't be an exception. It should be crisis. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, good.
But
Yeah.
But the other thing too is how does this hit, not to be selfish, but how does it hit the dad's functions as far as our necessitated reviews for quality assurance for that?
So I think
So are we
yeah,
going to be the reviewing agency that then says to Aaron, you're supposed to, this person's changed, they've vacillated from one extreme to another, you need to go forward and have this re-reviewed,
mhm.
kind of a thing?
It's a good question, Matt, and I think that's something that we need to determine. I don't
There
know,
was
Jess.
Oh, I didn't expect an answer at
Yeah.
all for that.
Oh,
but,
I love the recommendation. I think there was one
Yeah.
other recommendation too that you made, Matt. You were on a good roll and I was trying to capture it.
Did you capture if
Um,
it's less than a year, it shouldn't be an exception, it
that's
should
what
be
it
a
is.
crisis, because I thought that was
Yeah, that
I
was
don't
what it
wanna-
was. I heard it and I was like, oh, that's
I
what
don't want,
yeah.
Matt.
But I would say there would be an exception to that rule too, because if we have someone that, let's say, is in New Hampshire State Hospital, and we're gonna have to get that exception saying that this higher rate is where they're at in order to get them placed at like Easter Seals, or I hate to say an out-of-state provider or something like that, so that they know that they're able to take that person at that higher rate, and
Mhm.
that higher rate's gonna be for this foreseeable future, so that they can plan accordingly for staff and develop, and Easter Seals would, I know for a fact, or agree with this, develop a solid treatment plan for them. And some
Right.
of our individuals, they're not looking like 6 months ahead. They're not even looking a year ahead. They're thinking 3-4 years ahead to get
Yeah.
them to the point to where they can step down. So they're really doing a lot of long-term envisioning.
Yeah, and I think that situation would just depend on, will the crisis funding meet that need or not? And if it didn't, could there be, a reach out for that? Especially if it's someone brand new that people just don't know what, so.
Kind of hearing is some guardrails, but also the ability for any group that's reviewing or putting one forward to kind of use judgment from a person-centered planning standpoint. These are our best practices, but each individual could potentially need something unique to them, and we wouldn't want it to prevent an exception request from coming through. But just some general guardrails to kind of go through and see, gee, would crisis funding meet this need? Yes, okay, let's do that, and kind of revisit to see if it's long-term versus crisis funding would meet the need, but at the same time, to Matt's example, a new provider is identified, but they want a commitment of ongoing funding before they're willing to fully agree to be the service provider. So guidelines, but flexibility is kind of the spirit of what I'm hearing. Okay.
And I do think there needs to be some overriding factor. So we have all these things in place, but there needs to be an exception to the exception policy where,
because we don't know.
And I do think that should be stuck and left in BDS's hands. So maybe Jess, you have the ability to, in a memo, memorialize whatever it is and authorize X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Not to dump a whole bunch of power in your hands, but the reality is I do think until the benefit that we've had for the last at least 4 years I've been in the system is that, you had people like Sandy Pelletier and all these, Brian Collins, all these people work with like Matthew Urtas and everything over the last 40 years to get everything situated and humming along. And with this being new, there's just gonna be so many things we didn't
We
intend
don't know.
for.
Right.
Yep. And there probably should be a built-in review policy where we look at the guardrails, like a sunsetting, where we're forced to look at them every like 2 or 3 years or something. Or when does the new waivers have to be written? Are they the ABD and DD waivers and IHS? Are they all submitted to the federal government at the same time?
No, they're about, so IHS will renew on January 1st, 26, and then DD's September of 26, and ABD's November of 26. So
But they're all
spaced
26.
enough. They're all 26.
yeah.
Yeah, they're a few months.
Yeah,
apart.
so if they're all ending within within the same year, then we should be putting this stuff on the same cycle. So
Yeah.
that we're looking at it. You know, maybe we look at every 2 years so that it's not an overly exhausted service. Shelley, help me out. You look like you have a thought. I have no problem embarrassing people, sorry.
No, I just have a bunch of thoughts. I guess to your question of somebody in New Hampshire hospital, and I was kind of typing it down just to ponder later, but are we realistically going to even have a cyst done for them before they get out and get placed? I mean, maybe some point in the future, but I don't think short term. So then what are you going to use to place them initially? And then are they an exception to start with because they just don't have a cyst done?
Good question. So you're
Best
saying,
question.
what happens if there is not a SIS in place? How does the person get the services that they need in the interim? Right?
Yes.
I like the idea of Aaron answering that.
The other thing to that too is, or if their SIS is, because although we're gonna, you know, we all want things to run really well, what if their SIS is expired? Will it stay current until a new one is done? Those are the things we all need to know and talk about. So Aaron, sorry if you were raising your hand. I got excited with Shelley's comment.
No, I wasn't raising my hand.
Matt was
raised
calling you
for
out.
me. Yeah.
Listen, you just stayed
So
where
I'm
you were at. I
supporting
just
you
stepped
now.
back.
Oh, Sudip's on the board. Okay, we can go ahead, Sudip. Sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking, just to piggyback, Shelley's, if individuals need services, they need services. If there's an emergency, it's an emergency, from the day
Yes.
one, we need to provide
Yes.
staffing support and all that. And if there is CIS is not really scheduled, it does take some time, to complete the CIS. So
Yeah.
if we're really saying that CIS, needs to be done before they receive services, any type of waiver services, that puts the limitation in delivering the services. So I'm really thinking that if that is the case, then I think the crisis funding should cover those temporary services before the CIS happens.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to think that way also,
Right. We need to have a plan for those situations, which we will all try to prevent, but we still need to have a plan.
I
Carrie.
hear what you're saying, Sudith,
Oh,
but I think,
sorry.
but I think, since Matt raised my hand for me. But what I'm thinking of that New Hampshire hospital folks, when they come out, I mean, are we going to then be taxing our crisis funding a lot for those people that are transitioning? And just to kind of get back to Matt's question, when we transition, and I'm working on a transition out of New Hampshire hospital right now, when we do that, we have a lot of pre-meetings where we're talking with the team, we're talking, about past history and all of that. What I would almost see is having somebody transition out with, CBARs are done, with kind of the team saying, we feel the person will fall here. And within that first 6 months after being come out, that CIS will get done so that you can have that time frame, but at least they can come out and we're not just kind of taxing on that crisis funding.
Okay,
Because we
so
do a lot of
allow the
transitions
team
out.
to inform where the support needs of the individual in the interim, if you will. Okay.
Some kind of flexibilities there has to be. Some of these,
Yeah.
are planned. We can be, they can be planned. Some of them are like, this crisis occurs like, instantly. So we have to provide services. And it's not only the folks coming out of the hospital. Sometimes people can be just dropped off, on your door. So,
Family member
Yeah.
passes away and the family
Yeah.
member's been taking care of the person.
Yeah.
We literally just had that happen and we
Yeah.
had to get, we had to get an emergency placement and we had to, get a rep payee because the individual was also the rep payee. So.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. Yeah. So we're saying we work with individuals in their lives, and no matter how well we develop a process, there are always things that happen, yeah. Matt?
Well, Carrie had her hand up for a little bit, so I don't know.
Oh,
if she's,
sorry, Carrie.
No, I just, and actually Suit Up, you said it exactly. I was just gonna share that
Oh.
when we talked to a couple of states, they do have exactly what Suit Up articulated as a process to be able to support individuals who may not have a CIS or may not have a current CIS and using that team approach. So I just wanted to, just sort of double back on what Suit Up had commented on.
Yeah, my comments were essentially going to be the same. We process people all the time without CIS right now. I just don't think we should be changing that. So as a great example of someone, and one of the things I would really like to see change is how people are processed through the emergency room. Get that original diagnoses that they need or support that they need for whatever. But I think getting them long-term funding and not just going off a crisis, like crisis to me should be 3 months of funding, no more.
Mhm.
And you should have the ability to re-up it, once or twice after that with BDS approval.
Mhm.
But I don't think we should be doing crisis at the area agency level for more than 90 days. Because you're not in a crisis after 6 months. And if you're still in a crisis in 6 months, why are you still in crisis? Like
Mhm.
that's just my
Right.
2 cents, and feel free to
Right.
yell at me later.
Okay, so I forget what even the question was that we were all just working.
Well, so the next
Yeah.
question we were getting
Yeah.
to, and there's a couple of other
Yeah.
things that I want to
Yeah.
just round off in the recommendations. You guys are on a roll.
Yeah.
So should there be stipulations around time periods? And I think there was a recommendation made, and I started to capture it around not more than, hold on.
Oh, so many. Consider
I think there
not
was
more
a
than
not
two
more than two.
exceptions. Two
Yeah.
exceptions in,
In a certain time period, or are you guys thinking that maybe be a guardrail, but that, we build some flexibility to, make sure we're meeting needs?
right, because here's the question about this too. If an exception is submitted and it's denied, and it's appealed and it's still denied, can the person submit one the next month and the next, what I'm being extreme here, but we do need to develop some, because we want to make sure that everyone's using their time wisely and not, so.
I think we need to limit who can submit the exceptions. Like it needs to be limited to the service coordinator. Because if you have a service coordinator submitting exception after exception after exception for a person, either they're doing a really terrible job of justifying the exception, and we need to do some training for that person, or they don't understand the exception process and we still need to do training for that person. And I think if someone had submitted an exception twice for the same person and it was just so poorly written that, I don't think anyone would just submit 2 exceptions for no reason. So I think at that point we would need to investigate. And again, would that be a dad's function? Because maybe I think one of the things is if we're going to have them do a meeting prior to make sure it's not crisis, then the area agency should probably be reviewing to make sure that person can't submit an exception without their okay. And that might have to be the first hurdle.
Oh, Cynthia.
I guess I think that there are other reasons why an exception might be submitted twice or more than twice and not
Yeah.
solely that the service coordinator doesn't know how to do that.
Mhm.
There may be a guardian or family member who doesn't agree with the decision, and they will be persistent and direct and require the service coordinator to request another exception. And that will place the service coordinator, if they don't follow through with that,
Yeah.
places the service coordinator in a very difficult position with that family member. I don't think that is the
Yeah.
rule, but that absolutely
Yeah.
is a reality
Right.
in some of the situations that service
Right.
coordinators work with.
Yeah, so this
So
is a
if you
tough,
all-
oh, go ahead, Jess.
Oh, I was gonna say, so if you all kind of recommend incorporating this component here, either the person or the entity that submits, as well as like a pre-discussion with someone to take a look and talk and maybe suggest some other avenues that might, because an exception might not even be needed. There might be another way to get at that need. Do you think that that maybe might also meet what the goal of this, the way I heard it was, to just reduce the number of kind of maybe unnecessary exceptions so that we wouldn't even need to make a recommendation of two, rather we have someone kind of giving it an eye before it gets submitted for review?
I think that's it. And Cynthia, I think the point I was trying to make is if they're making continuous exception requests, not so much as if you have something different happening, but we also have to be okay with telling our families no at times. Because if it's an unrealistic request, we have to be able to say, like, this is not something we can or should be doing. I agree. Our families put us in difficult situations and we do have to do the best we can and we do have to follow their direction. But there are limits to that, that we should have in place. And I think having the first safeguard being a pre-meeting should help cut that down with the families. And I don't agree that, or I'm not suggesting that saying no to families should be a rule, but at some point there is limits we have to say we can or cannot do.
The other thing I just want to throw out there in just the spirit of brainstorming, if an exception is denied and it's appealed and it's denied, is there a certain time frame that the person can't submit another one? Sometimes that's a process, so you're not you know what I mean? Then it helps the service coordinator, explain to the family, we have to wait, I don't know, a year before another one could be submitted. You've followed the process. I'm just not sure. Because I do understand that, Cynthia, the service coordinator is there to support the individual, the family, and it can be a tough place to be sometimes in the middle of it.
Do we have to follow certain appeal processes like through the AAU?
That's
Is that what?
another,
If it was
Yeah.
if it was a formal appeal, then yes.
Yes.
Well, that might
Yeah.
inform how it needs to be limited.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I
Thank
mean,
you.
I think essentially if the group's recommendation is that there are certain decisions that can't be appealed, I mean, of course, we would need to get the authority for that within our rule, but I mean, those structures can exist if that's the recommendation.
I hate to be the wet blanket, but there's always exceptions. So I could see a situation where someone has a cyst done, the family guardian, someone doesn't agree with the score, so they appeal it twice and it still gets denied. And then somewhere, shortly after that, caregiver passes away and now they need to go to a placement, a much more restrictive setting than living at home. So now we do need an exception again. You know what I mean? So I think maybe the wording needs to just be careful.
Yeah. Right. It's hard to write, we need to have good guidelines and transparency, but there needs to be flexibility because it's a human life, right? Yeah.
So maybe we remove the limitation on how many exceptions and we
Yeah.
just keep it so that you have to get like area agency buy-in with the service coordination to get through that first meeting, that crisis meeting, that first hurdle.
So Matt, who do you see would be like the area agency team? And I'm sure it would be set up by each area agency. And how would that work? Because being from where we sit and some of our folks, we, have outside providers, they're not area agency providers. So we would need to coordinate getting everybody together to be able to sit down with the, and I'm not disagreeing to have like that first layer, that's for sure. But I'm just thinking logistically, And again, I would say that there'd be one form that would be used for all 10 area agencies, because I don't want to be doing 10 different forms in regards to
Right.
anything that's going on.
I think it has to be whoever is designated for that. And we would have to determine who would be designated. And I can't speak for the other regions, and Kelly would probably have a different spin on it than I would, and Cynthia most certainly would, because Cynthia's got a clinical background. You know, it would have to be that, like for me, I would ask the couple members of my HRC committee to be the ones that you would have to meet with. And my director of service coordination. But Cynthia probably has a better idea as to what's most clinically appropriate. And Kelly, I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts would be. And Suda would probably have a good handle on it as well.
Matt, you didn't name me, but I get just gonna add a
And not
comment
because I didn't,
here.
I forgot about you. I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. I am kind of curious to hear from other area agencies. This just feels like the involvement of the area agency, it just feels like another kind of bureaucratic overlay. I just want to make sure that we really establish the value that that delivers. And as we think about that, to make sure we can't address it by at the service coordinator or the service coordination agency level. And I don't really have, I just want to ask the question, but it feels like another layer that's going to bog things down and add to an administrative burden. And I'm not positive of the value. So if I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that. Thank you.
So I might just jump in here from BDS a little bit. The crisis policy states that when an individual is in crisis, to involve the area agency for networking or whatever. So I'm wondering if the role would be as just as a communication and information mat, where you might be able to give information and advice to the team that they may have not thought of, that might it result in them saying, oh, that makes sense. We don't need to go the exceptions route. But would you want to be the stamper of if they made it through the exceptions process or not? And because that does add intricacies to, the process.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Because we're already doing the crisis
situation.
Yeah,
right.
And during the crisis situation, you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, a more long-term fix is going to be needed here.
Yeah.
So that's
so it
why
might be a consulting role and be definitely informed. So it versus it, if it doesn't make it through the area agency, it doesn't go to the exceptions process, because I don't know, it's just.
Well, so my thought process is, what if they don't go through the crisis situation or crisis request, and they just skip over it?
Right, I see what you're saying. So if I am a service coordinator and I notice that something is, an individual gets a new diagnosis that is going to definitely change their support needs immediately. The team has been wondering what's going on with them, and they know that this is going to be a long-term change. It might not be a crisis for tomorrow, but it's definitely something different. Then we might build into that there's communication with the dad's entity about that, similar to the crisis, but it doesn't, like, I hear what you're saying. What if it doesn't go through the crisis route, Lori? I think it's important that the dad's entity be informed and know, because you're responsible for like quality services within your region and what's happening. So we definitely don't want to skip that, but just something to consider of what would that role be? What would be the limits of that? I don't know the answer. I'm just throwing that out, like Ellen was saying.
We still hold the liability for their welfare. So if we are not informed as to what's going on with those individuals, and let's say a provider's not providing the right services, we're the ones that get sued first too. So the liability of us managing the services, we need to make sure that everyone's getting the appropriate services from the appropriate providers at the appropriate times. Unless the service coordination entities are going to take over that liability themselves,
Right, so,
and divest us from that dad's responsibility.
right,
So
so
I
I
put a
guess
couple
my,
of things in here
Yeah,
based on
yeah.
some of the discussion too. So maybe we've kind of captured the crisis process and that the area agency would definitely already be at the table for that. But if we weren't following the crisis process, and again, I'm typing as you guys are talking, so I want to
Yeah.
make sure I'm not taking too much artistic liberty and summarizing what's being said. So maybe the availability of the area agency for a pre-review, if maybe the service coordination entity wanted to talk about the
Well-
exception or maybe talk about other options.
Well, I think that's the other thing too, is like, so when I look at this stuff, I'm thinking, what if there's just another provider? Let's say the diagnosis of dementia, very clearly that you're going to have someone's life is going to change permanently. Depending on the speed of which that occurs, an exception may need to be done or not. It also depends on the ability of the provider to keep that person, may need an exception or not. So I mean, there's some providers in the state that can make things work for much longer than they need to. And
So
do we
maybe
wanna, Farmsteads has a policy that they're going to allow everyone to age in place regardless of what challenges come forward. And so that's going to be a situation at some point that's going to be challenged, obviously, by just the nature of life. And they're going to have to figure out how to make things work. And the question being is, how do they figure out how to make things work? And whether it's going to be a crisis or not depends upon the level of care and attention they're paying. I think where it gets different, and it goes from a glacial pace or a horizontal pace, is when you have someone that has immediate changes or diagnoses are going to predict immediate changes. Any which way, the area agency needs to be involved to make sure that the quality of care is provided to the extent and level necessary to support that person in a safe environment. Because that's the whole function of the area agency, if not anything else.
So I captured here based on some of that discussion. It sounds like the group is feeling, regardless of whether it's an optional or required area agency pre-review, to discuss the need for the exception or other options. Definitely, it sounds like there's agreement from the group that the area agency should be notified, ideally through New Hampshire Easy, I would think, if it flows in there, but in some capacity, however this gets rolled out, that an exception was requested, and then also what the review team's decision was. Is that kind of capturing all of that accurately for the group?
Yeah, I guess so. Ellen or Kelly, I know, has a.
And then availability of the area agency for a pre-review or requirement of I did it again. Sorry, or a requirement that the area agency be involved in a pre-review. Sorry, somebody's going to take my mouse away from me. I think that might be the last question to kind of solidify the group's recommendation in that area. And I could just highlight it if folks want to kind of think about it and come back to it.
Yeah. Shelley?
Because I hear, so the spirit of what I'm kind of hearing said here is that the goal of the pre-review would actually be to ease some of that administrative burden to the team and to the individual, because there might be other options out there. But then also, the group bringing up that it could potentially create administrative burden by doing that. So, really thoughtfully approaching how that's operationalized to ensure, one, it's ready to roll out right when the exceptions process rolls out, and two, that it's not creating another layer. It really is meant to help move it through and not create an additional step. Sorry, go ahead, Shelley.
Thank you. So, pondering all these things that we're talking about and Matt saying, I'm not sure from an area agency perspective. I think if I want to be bogged down in that process, but I am going to point out from the dad's perspective, H5, critical management,
Mhm.
we're here, and maybe this is how it gets tied into the area agency to provide technical assistance to service coordinators when a service coordinator
Yes,
is out in advance of a potential crisis. So I think
Yes.
that's where it needs to tie in, and however that
yes,
happens, that's the piece.
yeah. So I think we're
Makes sense.
definitely, as Jess said, we're definitely on the page that whether if it follows the crisis route, the agency should be involved. If for some reason it doesn't follow the crisis route, we're saying the agency should still be involved for quality oversight networking. The question becomes, which we don't have to answer today, is do you need the stamp of approval from the area agency to push through the exception, or just that they're in the know and served as technical assistance to the team, which may in which could result in them not following the exception process and looking at something else or continuing with the process. So that's kind of the question there that I think, Ellen, if I go back to you, you were like, I'm not sure of, that. If I,
Yeah. I mean, honestly, my deference is to the area agencies that are on
Yeah.
this call.
Okay.
I was just raising a flag.
Yeah.
I'm not, I know my limitations. I'm not in the field. I'm not
Yeah.
providing direct services. I'm not
Yeah.
going to opine on that. I just was like,
Yeah, no, it's good.
so that's all.
No,
thank
thank
you
you,
for-
Ellen. I think it was good input for the group to consider.
I would say like the area agency shouldn't be the gatekeeper, at least for the first pass. But I would think that if I was a case management agency, my first pass got rejected, I might go to the area agency and require technical assistance before I made my second request.
I think they should be able to submit without our approval.
Okay,
Absolutely. But I do think we should submit like we agree with this or we don't.
okay,
And so they come to us as Shelley said and said, we want this, and we turn around and we say we agree with you. That goes up with the
mm-hmm,
request. But if they submit and we don't agree with it, we should either not submit something agreeing with it, or we should have a reason as to why we don't think it should go forward. Because it might just be the family doesn't want to do whatever the crisis assistance is.
good
And
point. Yeah, okay,
that's not going to be, I mean, why are we going to spend or commit ourselves to, as a state, to a budget of $700,000 on an annuum when we could fix the issue on the short term for $50,000? And it might just be that.
Well,
So that's
also
where I'm
think-
kind of going with all that.
I
thank you,
also
Ann.
think to Cynthia's point in regards to guardians and, requesting you to do it, I think service coordination should also be able to know on that they don't agree with it and that it's been pushed through, so that it's not
Yeah.
shown that that we're putting it through. It's like, well, we don't agree with it. We were told we had to do this. So
Yeah.
we're just doing it.
Okay,
But that puts you guys in such a bad spot. That's why I was like trying to take the heat off you. I think we all know I don't mind being contentious. But the service coordinators, I always try to, at least at our organization, be the one that's the problem. So the families have someone that they can say, that guy's a jerk.
Mhm.
When realistically it's, no one's agreeing with them. So they have that person that's still safe to them.
Yeah, and I'm that person here. So
I know.
yeah. But I think the thing is a lot of times we will have those conversations with families and we'll say, we don't agree with this. And they say, you have to submit it. And we'll say to them, we will submit it, but you need to understand we don't agree with this, and just let them know, or they'll say, Erin said that we can't agree with this, but, and keep that relationship good. And they can be mad at me. That doesn't matter.
Do you all envision a why spot here? Is it just endorsed or not endorsed? If it's not endorsed or endorsed, do you want some sort of, or are you recommending there be the ability to kind of say, hey, because you could get to this at crisis funding, or, you know, whatever that general rationale was, or just keep it at endorsed or not endorsed.
So,
And I'm saying for
One-
area agency and for service coordination.
so one of the things that the local review committee in Florida has is a template, and I'll send you what I have, so you can see it. But it's a template and it asks 10 questions that goes along with the rules and regs. And basically, did you try a lesser intervention before you're trying this intervention? Was there other interventions that were options? And I think there needs to be that standardized review document that goes along with it. And then the question should maybe be, is it endorsed by the service coordinator, by the provider, and by the area agency? And in that meeting, they can give their logic or reasoning as to why or why not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be helpful if you didn't endorse it and I was on the exceptions review team, which I'm not saying I would be. I would want to know why, like because A, B, and C could be done or something like that. I would want to get the feedback of the team as to why, you know, or what the other options were that could avoid the exception.
I like the idea of understanding why everyone is endorsing it. So if I'm sitting at that meeting and I have all the providers and I have the area agency and I have Aaron sitting there
Yeah,
and they're saying, we need this, to me, that gives much more credence and comfort because no one's going to stand up and say, we don't need it. And then
okay.
ask for it to be pushed forward.
Karen?
So Matt, you just looped back around and made it so that service coordination needs to get the endorsement of the area agency. Where the thought was, are we going to do that? Or like Shelley said, technical assistance. And you just looped it all the way back around
So
then.
remember, I'm not the one that brought up, I don't think we should have that. I'm the one who's been consistently saying we should have it. So I have not changed my position.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Vote for me, 2024. And I think Ellen's point,
Oh,
and I
that's
think
funny.
she raises a really good point, and Ellen has a way of looking at the other side of the coin. So I really value the opinion is it necessary? And that's the question, is it necessary? And I think maybe we don't have the requirement that you have to have the area, and this is where I'll give. We don't have to have the endorsement, but if you see the endorsement there, it gives more credence or what have you to the request. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do, but what if now you're devil's advocate. You're the provider. You're also the area agency. So you're going to sign off on yourself?
Well, that's the age-old conundrum that we've been in. And so I think
Yeah.
at the end of the day, you can loop back and put more, and whoever's on that committee can put more weight or less weight on the opinion of the area agency and the provider or on the service coordinator. But I think there's got to be some credence given to the professionalism of all the people involved. Just because there's an appearance of conflict doesn't mean that necessarily is.
Yeah.
And if we have people operating outside the rules and realms of ethics, then they probably need to be held accountable. And I'll leave that to Jess and Lori to sharpen their pitchforks. So
Yeah,
I think this is all good conversation as
Yeah,
well. I mean, and some of it too,
It is.
make the initial recommendation. And then as we
Yeah.
start to consider how do you operationalize these recommendations, there could be things that bring folks back to the drawing board or just are simply discussed and, you know, solved for through the operational process. So, I mean, good points, and I'm capturing them too.
Yeah.
Because they can be passed along as it moves through the process. I also want to say, and I should have said at the beginning of the slide, I apologize. If I'm typing something, folks, if I'm getting something wrong, please don't hesitate to come off mute or raise a hand and say, Jess, that's not quite what we said. I'm trying to capture the group's thoughts here.
And just going back to what you said, you're exactly right. What we plan today in a year is going to look totally different. Because as we're doing it, we're going to be tweaking everything along the way. That's what always happens. So
Yeah.
That what I promise I did not just, tap tap Aaron to make that comment, because I flagged that here where we talked about consider building
Yeah.
a system to review the practice itself. So we
Yeah.
talked, and I think we actually talked about this enough to give us some good feedback here in the last meeting, where we said, hey, we want to make sure that there's also data track. Lori mentioned before, if we're seeing a lot of exceptions for one particular service, what does that mean about the support levels and how they're arranged? So
Yeah.
Aaron, to your point, as kind of dovetailing off of that same thought from a statistic process, or also the operations of it, is it meeting the needs, is it not meeting the needs? That understanding that we'll want to make sure we're going back to the drawing board to review, to review, so that we can go back to the drawing board and make sure that the process as well is flexible and nimble to meet needs and be revised based on what we're seeing.
The only thing I would ask is that we keep a uniform practice and we do as much of this into New Hampshire easy as possible, if not all of it. So to Aaron's point, we don't, Shelley and I and Cynthia and Sudip are not all doing different things. Like as much as we can get into New Hampshire easy, the same process. I would love to eventually get rid of my own EHR system, or not EHR, EMR system if possible. Not entirely, but to do everything in New Hampshire easy. One centralized record. It'd also make training service coordinators so much easier. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah.
Also make
Agreed.
transferring of individuals so much easier too.
Yeah.
I just had John Lennon's song Imagine start going through my head.
Yeah. That was perfect, Ellen. Okay, so just to kind of frame where we are, because we finished at noon today. First of all, I thought we were going to speed rocket through this, and I thought we were going to spend most of our time on the exceptions review team composition, but we haven't even hit that today. And with respect of everyone, I don't think that it's appropriate that we jump into that today. But Jess, are we still? Yeah, so the next is the review team. I was thinking what we would do is probably put that to our next meeting, and not get into that today, but I can start, but we have 11 minutes left.
Or
Jess,
maybe
am I missing something?
I don't think so. Or maybe we could start to, between now and next month, if folks want to kind of look ahead in the slide deck.
Right.
This information, we can talk about it on this question, certainly, to add some additional context, but just a quick review that this is all meant to give you all context information as you consider what the recommendations would be. And then we can pick up here next month when, to start forming the recommendation on these questions. Does that work, Lori?
Yeah, and for the individuals joining us, just so you know, if you could slide down in this deck, Jess, what Jess has done a really excellent job with, and our supporters from M&S, is the appendix is growing as if you were on the rate work group and you missed a former meeting, we've captured the recommendations of I think it was our March 15th meeting, don't quote me, on this slide. So it's a really good cumulative resource for you to, take the time and read and look at what our process has been to date. Because some of the things that came up today is what would warrant an exception. And we did talk about some of those things. So that's kind of where we're at. So our next meeting, if we could go maybe just to the last slide of today, if you could even find it. Okay, good. Look at how good you are. So May 17th is our next work group meeting. What we will be definitely picking up is the composition of the review team. We'll be getting out to you before then the notes that Jess took today for your review. And then we'll take it from there. And we're going to start then BDS is going to meet internally to begin to kind of review the feedback, look at it, and begin to draft a exceptions operational process and the composition of the team. Just a reminder, we are going to be getting out a cost report to all providers during the month of July/August. Oh, Ellen, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see you. Your hand. Ellen, is your hand up?
I'm sorry. Yep.
Okay.
I was,
okay.
I didn't unmute. I was just saying, please finish what you're saying, but a question when you're done is just, when can we anticipate start getting back into the thick of things on the rollout of service rates and so forth? Do you have a thought? Do you have, a rough ballpark for that?
Yeah, so we will probably begin to look at that in the June meetings, June and July. We'll be picking that back up. I wanted to wrap up the exceptions process and things like that, and then give information on the cost report, get that out, and then go back to our rates work.
Yeah, as Lori and I really kind of discussed it too, and based on what this group has been sharing for a period of time, we thought it was really critical that we get into the exceptions conversation and have that recommendation developed. Because we want to make sure that we have flexibility built in. So having this happen kind of parallel or so that it's ready to be implemented along with everything else really seemed critical. So spending a bit of time here to make sure that our group has a recommendation that's provided. And just one other contextual thing, as Lori was explaining to the group, if anyone's missed the last meeting, or if you're watching from the audience and grab the slide deck, what we wanted to do was just make sure everyone had some foundational information on processes. So this isn't us saying, hey, we want to follow any one of these states' processes. No. But to give some information from a bit of a nationwide perspective. And then as you go on to the next slide, same questions, we bring it closer to home. So the assessment focus group that happened as a subcommittee of the advisory, what were they saying? What were their recommendations when things were still a bit more conceptual too? And then now bring all of that information here for the rate work group to create a recommendation, which is what I'm trying to capture as I'm typing. So just a little bit of context there.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jess. I just wanted to thank all of you for participating, because this is exactly the process that we want in New Hampshire, is working together in partnership, getting feedback, and developing a good process. And as we talked about today, even when we develop something, we're going to learn as we go through it, and having the opportunity to review our work and say, how do we want to adjust our sales will be important. So with that, are there any final questions? If you have feedback for BDS about what, if there's anything that you could suggest we could do differently, we're open to that too. You have the email to give us feedback on that. Okay. All right. Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you very much. And we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great.